Dirty Bird podcast contains foul language and is not appropriate for young fledglings. Listener discretion is advised. Our intro music is brought to you by Ricky Pistone, aka Dick Piston. And our outro music is brought to you by the Sidewalk Slammers. Check them out wherever you get your music.
Are you looking for a podcast today with ornithology and humor you crave? Well, I know all these guys and it's birds they like. It's Dirty Bird, yeah, they're just a couple guys who really like birds. It's Dirty Bird, yeah, they're pretty dirty, but they really like birds.
Hello, and welcome to Dirty Bird Podcast, a podcast that's serious about birds, but nothing else. In each episode, I pick an individual bird species and tell you everything you need to know about it. I do all the research, read all the articles so that you don't have to, and bring you the interesting facts and tell you everything from their life history to their evolutionary history. I try to include myths and legends about these birds also. And for October, for this spooktacular episode, I've chosen a special bird, the common raven. Quoth the raven, nevermore. I do talk a bit about ravens in my very first Icelandic episode, where I talk with my Icelandic friend, Ari. But I felt like Halloween, October, was the perfect time to dedicate a full episode to them. And I'm really excited to be recording from Gaudineer Forest right now. This has been a place that's been on my bucket list to record for a long time. I actually came up here one time and recorded an episode just about the forest and recorded kind of the ambience of the bird sounds up here. This is a very, very special place because it is one of the last virgin forest stands in the U.S. and I think the only red spruce virgin stand in the eastern U.S. So basically, I would like to release a whole episode, a mini episode where I tell the whole story about this place. But basically, there was a clerical error between two timber companies. And so this never, ever got 50 acres of red spruce up here, never got cut. And so there are red spruce up here that are like 400 years old. It is a primeval forest. It feels magical. Like, I feel like I'm in Lord of the Rings right now. There's moss and ferns and then just these giant spruce trees. Where I'm sitting right now, I'm sitting on a downed spruce that is massive. And then there are some spruce around me that are probably about, 100 years old or so. They're like, I don't know, their diameter is probably like 5 or 6 feet. But then there are some dead spruce that I can see that are just giants. Like, they're wider than, my arm span. They got to be like 10, 12 feet across. Unfortunately, they're dead, but, that's what happens, eventually. And so it's a beautiful area. And then Gaudineer, it's named after a forest ranger of the early 1900s, a super cool dude who was like this massive, 6'7" guy that was called the Ranger's Ranger, just because he, was a workhorse and did a lot of work with suppressing forest fires. Then actually died in a fire. He was trying to rescue his 3 daughters from a house fire, and unfortunately they all died in that fire. And so then this was named in his honor. So a great place, a magical place, honestly, to be recording in, and also a place where we might hear the subject of today's episode, the common raven. We might hear them. I actually saw one when I was driving in, so let's hope that they give a croak or two for us to pick up on the mic. Before I begin, also, let me give a shout out to Erica for writing in. She, has been listening through the show and let me know that, Sound recording's not the best on some of my early episodes, so I do definitely plan on some of the cold months of winter to go back and try to re-edit some of those episodes. Thank you so much, Erica, for letting me know, things that should be improved on the show. I really appreciate that. Y'all, write in, let me know what you like, what you don't like. And also, Erica let me know that she wanted some stickers, so I sent some stickers her way for free. So let me know, y'all, if you want some free stickers to share the Dirty Bird love. I am more than happy to send some out to you. And also, let's do this episode's Bird Watch. This is a segment I just introduced in my last episode. It's where I ask listeners to write in and send me a voice memo or just, text, that's fine, in an email or whatever, letting me know a recent cool bird experience you had. And it is very fitting that our first listener bird watch comes from none other than the infamous Jay Pogo.
Morning, baby. Morning, baby. I gotta ask you a question. Yo, and this is respect to all Karens out there. You hear that? You hear that? Love is love. But that's a blue jay. Would you agree that blue jays are like the birds' Karens? The bird world. Oh, shit. Karens for the bird world. Would you agree on that before I fucking go running with that? I'm going to my besties just to make sure I don't sound silly out there. I just want to know if you would agree. Holy shit. Holla. Yes or no? Yes or no? That's what I'm looking for.
So I'd give Jay Pogo a yes on that. And let me know, you bird besties out there. Blue jays are totally like the stereotypical Karen you see on the internet. They're like, let me talk to your manager, Blue jays in the forest are just such fucking tattletales, anything that goes on, they're calling, they're freaking out, they're talking to each other, they're getting all mad, a crow is around and they're like, this crow's trying to steal from everyone's nest, but then they'll turn around and they'll steal some eggs from a nest, like, oh, nope, the rules don't apply to me, only to other people. Honestly, I should Photoshop, use my terrible Photoshop skills to Photoshop like the Karen hairstyle onto a blue jay. But it's fitting that we're talking about blue jays because they are corvids, just like the common raven. They are also corvids. Ravens have made such a huge impression on humans, probably dating back to when we first began to, coexist with them. Their obvious intelligence and large black bodies instantly landed them in the mythology of many different cultures, like Norse mythology, where ravens are usually associated with the chief deity Odin, especially his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, which translates to thought and memory, and act as his spies and advisors. In classical and contemporary literature, such as Edgar Allan Poe's spooky tales, and in a lot of horror movies, ravens have a more sinister association with death and the supernatural. And while I'm going to mostly focus on the hardcore ornithology about ravens and less on their cultural significance to humans, I do want to bring back a Dirty Bird tradition in this episode where I started with a Native American cultural story. I haven't been able to do this in a while, probably not since my Morning Dove episode, I think. So I'm excited to kick off the show with one. As I've said before, I love Native American stories about birds because they often resolve around a really subtle bird behavior that you would only know if your culture had spent a lot of time intimately observing and living alongside these creatures. The tribes of the Pacific Northeast had a shared cultural tradition of stories about ravens. In a lot of different tribe stories, the raven is a trickster, kind of similar to Loki in Norse mythology. The raven also features in many of their creation myths and origin stories. The story I'll tell comes from the Tlingit tribe, who inhabited and still inhabit the coastal regions of southern Alaska and western Canada. In the Tlingit language, the raven is referred to as Kitkat Osit Iaka, with Kitkat Osit Iaka basically being God. So here's that story. When Kitka Ulsit Iaka's son Raven was born, his father taught him well on every subject. When Raven had learned all there was to know, his father said to him, "Now go and create a world of your own." At that time, the world was dark, and so Raven decided to start by bringing light to the world. Up the river Nas, there was a man in a great house filled with light, but he kept the house shut up tight so that no light could escape. Raven tried again and again to go into the house and to release the light, but the house was shut up tight and he could not get in. Finally, Raven had an idea. He transformed himself into a speck of dirt that fell into a cup of water that the man's daughter was drinking. After the daughter drank the speck of dirt that was Raven, she became pregnant. The daughter eventually delivered a healthy baby boy, who grew rapidly and soon began crawling around the house. The baby crawled to the back of the house and began pointing up at some of the bundles hanging on the wall, wailing loudly. Eventually the man, now a grandfather, angrily shouted, "Give the baby whatever he is crying for." The daughter took down the bag the baby was pointing to, which happened to be a bag of stars. The baby began playing with the bag happily, but eventually spilled the bag onto the floor, causing the stars to float up out of the smoke hole of the house, where they soon filled the sky. The baby began crying again and pointing at another bag. Irritated again, the grandfather shouted for the baby to be given the bag so he would stop crying. The baby was handed the next bag that contained the moon. Just as before, he played with it until it spilled and the moon went up the smoke hole and into the sky. Again, the baby began crying and pointed to the last object on the wall, a box that contained the sun. By now, the grandfather knew what would happen, but unable to tolerate his grandson's crying, he handed him the box. As soon as he had, the baby transformed into Raven, who seized the box and flew up through the smoke hole. However, he did not yet release the sun. Instead, he went to a well known to contain never-ending water. However, this well was also guarded by a man who didn't want it released. Raven disguised himself as the man's relative and was led into the house where the well was. That night, when the man was sleeping, Raven smeared dog dung on the man's buttocks. He then awoke the man, who, thinking he had literally shit the bed, ran into another room to clean up. Raven then began drinking as much water as he could from the well. When the man returned, he caught Raven drinking from the well and became angry. Raven attempted to fly up the smoke hole, but he was so fat with the water he became stuck. The man then began building a huge fire underneath Raven. The smoke poured up to the ceiling, and since Raven was clogging the hole, he became covered in smoke, causing his pure white feathers to turn black as night. Raven finally escaped and flew across the land, spitting water here and there to create the great rivers of the world. Where small drops fell from his beak, ponds, lakes, and creeks formed. Raven settled in a village where all the people there were clad in animal skins. Proud of his accomplishments, he told them his story. The people begged Raven to see his sunbox, and he obliged, opening it a crack to let a tiny shaft of light out. The people were so enamored by the tiny sliver of light that they soon began to beg and then aggressively demand that Raven show them more. As they advanced upon Raven with fists and weapons raised, he panicked and opened the box all the way. The sun shot out, releasing a great beam of light that turned all the people of the village into whatever animal whose skin they were wearing. As the sun rose into the sky to take up its current position, the people now turned into animals scurried into the forest, oceans, and rivers to become the animals that we know today. And that is how Raven helped create the world. So I love that story. One, we learn why ravens are black from smoke. It's kind of like a creation story. There's also tons and tons and tons of other stories about how, different other things are made. Like Raven also helps determine the length of winter and among a lot of other tales. So let's start off talking about the raven's scientific name. So the common raven's scientific name is Corvus corax. Corvus is the genus that contains crows, rooks, and ravens. The origin of this name is simple. It comes from the Latin word for raven, corvus. And similarly, corax is just a Greek word for crow or raven. The word raven itself comes from the old German word Raben, which, refers to ravens and crows. A group of ravens is called an unkindness or a conspiracy. oh, I don't like this. Like, oh, it's being mean to the ravens. I mean, I can see conspiracy, like they are intelligent birds, and as we'll learn, they probably are talking to each other when they're hanging out. So they are maybe forming a conspiracy, but unkindness, I mean, come on, they're not bad luck. It's kind of like the murder of crows thing. It's like, oh, come on, why are you being mean to them? And speaking of crows, you might think a raven is just a big crow. And they sort of are, but their bodies are shaped a little different. Ravens have a little bit more chonk to them. Their necks are thick, and they have a sharp, broad bill that's been described as looking like a Bowie knife. In fact, common ravens are the world's largest songbird. Ravens follow Bergman's rule, but not Allen's rule. It's been a bit since I've brought out the good old Bergman and Allen. Bergman's rule is that animals in colder climates have larger body sizes. Ravens in the northern part of the range tend to be larger, so they do follow Bergman's rule. But they defy Allen's rule. Allen's rule states that animals in colder climates have smaller appendages. Ravens in the northern part of the range actually have larger bills than those in the southern, so they defy the Allen's rule. And when you're watching ravens, if you're seeing them flying, you'll notice they are very acrobatic in flight. This reminds me of a time I was on Dragon's Tooth on the Appalachian Trail, and was up at the top there with those amazing rock formations and saw two ravens kind of playing, and they were just doing barrel rolls and flips and just riding the wind, and I mean, they looked like they were having a great time. In fact, ravens are so acrobatic that they can sometimes be seen flying upside down. There's one observation where a raven was observed flying upside down for a full half-mile. When they're in flight, you'll observe their long wedge or diamond-shaped tail, and also the long finger-like feather projections of their wings. This helps to tell them apart from crows that usually have more rounded or squared off tails and much shorter, broader wings than ravens do. Ravens also fly much more gracefully and effortlessly than crows. When you see a crow fly, they are described as swimming in the air, whereas ravens just have easy wing beats. You'll tend to see ravens hanging out in mated pairs. However, during the winter, they can form flocks of a few dozen ravens, and they'll also flock around food sources like carcasses. And as we'll also talk about in a bit, juveniles tend to flock together too. I'm going to say flock. I am not going to say unkindness. And while most ravens are entirely black from their bills to their feet, occasionally a white raven does pop up, and it really causes a stir in the bird world when it does. As I've talked about in the show before, white birds are rarely from albinism, but rather from a condition called leucism. In albinism, the body lacks the enzyme to produce melanin, while in leucism, the bird simply lacks the melanocytes, the cells that produce melanin. This means that their eyes are still dark. They don't have those pink eyes that occur in albinism. And leucism can occur over the entire body or just in a few patches. You should totally Google and look up pictures of white ravens. They look really cool. It looks like their bill is made of ivory. As far as their range and habitat, they have a whole Arctic distribution across the northern hemisphere, and they're largely found in temperate climates. They're not usually found in heavily urbanized areas. They prefer forests that are broken up by fields and with easy access to water sources. They can be found across North America and Eurasia. Their range dips as far south as Nicaragua and North Africa. They are a sedentary species. They do not migrate. However, they are long-distance foragers within their range. Ravens have been radio tagged traveling as far as 65 kilometers a day in search of food. When they're actively nesting, they're much more confined, though. They normally range only about 1.5 kilometers from around their nest. Juveniles and unmated ravens tend to live a more nomadic lifestyle where they'll follow food and water sources and not really be pinned down to a territory. So now that we got introductions out of the way for the common raven, let's dive into probably the most interesting subject about them, which is their intelligence. Corvids, crows, everyone knows that they are very smart birds, and the common raven is no exception. For starters, they have some of the largest brains in the bird world, weighing around 15.4 grams. But their brains are still proportionally much smaller when compared with primates. Birds can't afford to have those big, heavy brains because then they wouldn't be able to fly. However, they still have a workaround by packing a lot of neurons densely into their brains. In studies that have compared primate and corvid pallium tissue in the brain is similar to the cortex tissue in human brains, like kind of on the outside, and that's what's responsible for a lot of our higher level thought processes. Corvids have just as many, if not more, neurons than the great apes do, even with the great apes having more brain tissue to work with. In fact, the common raven has 1.2 billion more pallial neurons than the capuchin monkey. And, based on these brain studies and then also on some of the research on intelligence that I'm about to talk about, some of these studies, it's thought that by 4 months of age, that ravens are pretty much comparable to chimpanzees as far as intelligence. One of the ways that they demonstrate their intelligence is with their complex social structure. While mated individuals usually hang out in pairs, in the non-breeding season they will form flocks, and juveniles especially hang out in flocks until they have found their special someone. They will also flock around food sources like a dead deer. When ravens get together, a strict hierarchy forms based on age, breeding status, and other social factors. Ravens that have been captive raised appear to be lower in the pecking order than wild-raised birds, possibly because they missed out on key socialization teaching when they were young. Sort of like the kid whose parents never let them leave the house and now he's super awkward at parties in college. Within these flocks, ravens appear to communicate with each other about food locations. This also occurs among mated pairs too. This ability has only been observed in 3 other animals: bees, ants, and humans. Ravens have been observed locating a new food source, returning to their roost at night, and then the next day a raven that was roosting with them will go exactly to that food source without following that initial raven to that location. So it's not like they're just following the raven there. Like, a raven finds food, goes to its roost, they're all chit-chatting, and then they go to sleep, and then the next day another raven that was chit-chatting with that raven flies directly to that food source. So obviously, some kind of information was communicated about where to locate the food source. This has led to an argument that their vocalizations contain some element of language. They also do this directly at food sites. Juveniles especially will begin cawing when they find a large food source like a dead elk to call their friends to come eat. Another hint at their intelligence is that they play games. Young birds will especially play games. They fly in the air. They'll drop a stick and fly back down to catch it before it hits the ground. So, they're using toys there too. And this rang a bell too. I swear we talked about another bird species on this show that did that exact same thing with dropping sticks and then chasing after them. But for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. So any listeners out there, if you're able to tell me what episode that was, I'll send you a free t-shirt. They also will slide down snowbanks for fun. And their play isn't confined to their own species either. They've been observed playing a sort of catch me if you can with wolves, otters, and dogs. I wonder if the wolves even think this is a game or are just really pissed off at these ravens flying at them going, catch me, and the wolf is like, I'm going to eat that damn bird. Young birds are also intensively curious and will pick up objects that catches their fancy. These include shiny objects, leading to some anecdotal stories of ravens stealing precious objects like necklaces. As they age, though, ravens become less curious and more fearful of new things. Not unlike people. I don't like change. They also use tools, both in the wild and captivity. So, of course, using tools is a big deal. Less than 1% of animals have been documented using tools. But using them in the wild is also a big deal. There's multiple animal species. I think I talked about this in my blue jay episode. They've been taught to or observed spontaneously using tools in laboratory conditions or in captivity. But true tool usage in the wild is much rarer in species. Now, there are corvids that are much more sophisticated tool users, like the New Caledonian crows, that literally shape sticks to go after specific food items. Like, they'll literally turn them into like little hooks, and basically like they're forming little keys to like solve puzzles and get to food. Common ravens don't use this. In the wild, their tool usage largely revolves around dropping objects. There's been multiple accounts of ravens kicking up sand and dropping rocks on ornithologists who approach their nests to try to research the nests. Also in 1978 at Brigantine National Wildlife Refuge in New Jersey, a common raven dropped tufts of grass onto a nesting black-legged kittiwake, which is a type of gull, presumably to try to scare it off its nest so that it could eat its eggs. In captivity and laboratory conditions, ravens have been observed using objects as tools to acquire food. In an experiment done by Kabadiah and Osvath in 2017, ravens were taught to exchange specific tokens for food items. Even when there was a significant delay of hours to days, the ravens remembered that the token could be bartered for food. In a further variation on this experiment, the ravens were given the choice between the token or an immediate but less desirable food item. 73% of the ravens chose the token over the immediate food item, suggesting they have an ability for delayed gratification and to plan for the future. This is on par with about a 4-year-old child. In a similar experiment using tokens as exchange for food, ravens were able to recognize when they had been cheated and their human researchers were shorting them on the amount of food they had been trained each token was worth. In 2019, in a zoo in France, a female raven was observed using one of her feathers that she had specially modified to look like a sort of shovel, and she used it to grab food that had spilled out of her reach beyond her cage. And there's been other experiments too with common ravens. They go through a trial and error process to learn how to acquire food items that are locked behind puzzles. So they do have like a problem-solving ability. As you can see from these experiments, most of ravens' intelligence comes out when they are food motivated. So let's go ahead and talk about their feeding. They are famously hard to keep out of trash cans. They've even been known to open up tents and gain access to cars in order to get at food. They are omnivores and generalists. They pretty much eat a little bit of everything. And mostly they'll adapt to eat whatever is available in the area they are in. One of the things they especially like to eat, though, is eggs and nestlings of other birds. They will work in pairs to raid eggs from nesting birds, especially when raiding colonial nesters like seabirds. One bird will distract or lure a parent off its nest while the other steals its eggs. In Washington state, they have been observed raiding rhinoceros auklet colonies, using their bills to dig into the auklet burrows and steal eggs and chicks. The auklets are really powerless to stop them. Adults aren't off the menu either, and ravens will attack, kill, and eat adult auklets. Using those smart bird brains of theirs, ravens will actually exploit ornithologists that are researching the auklets. These researchers dug holes into the auklet nests to count the eggs and the chicks, then cover the holes back up with dirt. Well, the ravens saw this and greedily dug through the loose, freshly excavated soil to rob the nests. I can imagine how bad those researchers felt. Like, you're doing bird research, you're feeling good, like, yeah, researching birds, helping protect birds, and then you just watch the direct effect of your research is ravens raiding the nest and killing and eating those baby chicks that you just counted. They've also been known to dig into the burrows of tufted puffins, Leach's storm petrels, and bank swallows. Their own kind isn't off the menu. Common ravens have been documented raiding other ravens' nests and cannibalizing their eggs and nestlings. They go after bigger prey than just birds, too. They'll wait in trees for ewes and other mammals to give birth so that they can eat the afterbirth. They won't just go after the afterbirth, though. They'll also attack, kill, and eat newly born lambs. This is a serious problem on farms, and it's sort of brutal. The raven will just sit in the trees watching the ewe in labor, and then once it's delivered, exhausted and unable to defend itself, or its newly born lamb, the ravens will swoop down to feast. Ravens can be good for farmers, though. A study out of Algeria found ravens eat locusts, mice, and sparrows that would otherwise damage alfalfa crops. A big part of their diet, especially in the winter, is also carrion. And they've learned to follow hunters in order to scavenge on carcasses. This behavior almost certainly originated with predatory animals such as wolves, but transitioned to humans as we came to dominate landscapes in the past couple thousand years. There's stories of ravens following hunting sleds in snowy covered places like Norway. And their relationship with wolves is really cool. There's lots of research at Yellowstone National Park where after wolves were reintroduced, also studies of ravens found, the ravens actually following the wolves around. Raven populations doing a bit better because they were able to feast off of kills from the wolves. They don't just follow the wolves directly, they actually will track the wolves, recognizing their trails and following them. They also likely historically followed herds of bison, hoping for a sick animal to die or get, picked off by a predator. Of course, before bison were nearly eradicated by overhunting. And they will even fly towards gunshots. They don't flee like a lot of animals. They recognize that a gunshot means a hunter probably killed something, and they might get an easy meal from the field dressings of a freshly killed deer, elk, or moose. Similarly, they also will fly towards wolf vocalizations in hopes that the wolves are howling about a fresh kill. When they find carrion, though, their beaks are not strong enough to tear through the hide of the animals. So they must either wait for a predator to tear it open or some stronger scavenger birds like vultures to do the work. They've also been observed attracting wolves to carrion sites so that the wolves can tear open the carcass and allow the ravens access to the meat and innards. When at these kill sites, ravens will take turns feeding, but also in distracting other scavengers like wolves, coyotes, eagles, and magpies away from the kill site so that they're able to eat more for themselves. Interestingly, studies of cougar kills at Yellowstone National Park have shown that cougars, while they do kill animals, similar to wolves, their kills are not utilized by ravens. This is because cougars tend to hunt in steep areas, and they also cache their kills in thick brush or caves, making them inaccessible to ravens. They don't just scavenge, they also hunt small game like lizard, frogs, bugs, and small mammals like rodents, and even go after smaller birds too. Oh, I'm starting to hear some bird noise out here. So I'm hearing some black-capped chickadees. There's a fair bit of wind, too, blowing through the spruces. The forest up here is pretty quiet. It's a conifer forest, so there's not like a ton of bird species that you're usually used to. But I have been up here in the wintertime, and the mixed flocks of the chickadees, followed by the red-breasted nuthatches and the kingbirds, are pretty amazing as they move through the forest. There's also some squirrel species you don't usually see that are up here, like the red squirrel, which is really cool. It's super cute. It's got like little pointy ears. And then also there's northern flying squirrels up here also. Coastal ravens eat a wide variety of food ranging from seaweed and algae to invertebrates like polychaete worms, mollusks, and crabs. And then ravens foraging in fields, they'll eat grain, seed. They also will eat a lot of berries too when they find them. And they go after human sources of food too. Human food waste, when it's available, are definitely on the menu. And ravens are one of the birds that you'll find at a dump site. Like squirrels, ravens will cache food away to save for later. Anything from seeds to stolen bird eggs may be cached away, sometimes on rock crevices and sometimes just buried under sticks or leaves. Ravens will steal caches of other birds and also steal each other's caches. If a raven knows that it's being observed, it may engage in deception by making a fake cache, then moving its food to the real cache when the spying raven isn't looking anymore. And, since they eat a lot of eggs, with eggshells and, nestlings and animals that have bones in them that are undigestible, they will regurgitate those up in pellets similar to owls. So that's their feeding. Let's talk about their breeding. Ravens don't become sexually mature in their first year. The earliest is by their second year, and they can actually take up to 4 years to become fully sexually mature and begin breeding. Male ravens will perform acrobatic flying displays in order to attract a mate, diving off of cliffs or high trees. Females will fly with the male in order to seal their bond, and in what has been described as dancing in the sky, they will barrel roll, dive, and fly upward together, sometimes with talons interlocked. Once they find a mate, they are monogamous with that partner and aggressively defend their territory from other ravens year-round. Territories can be as large as several kilometers to as small as just a few hundred meters, depending on population density and food availability. They like to make their nests on cliffs, both naturally occurring and those left over from mines or quarries. They also nest in tall trees, usually kind of in like the crook of a tree between two big branches. They nest in human structures that mimic cliffs or trees too, such as utility poles, cell phone towers, and billboards. A raven couple will usually reuse the same nest and territory throughout their lives. They might kind of move to a different nest. Nests usually don't go empty. Like even if one couple decides to build a new nest, another raven couple will then use that same nest in the following year. Their nest is a large bowl made out of sticks and twigs with an inner layer of finer twigs, roots, bark, and mud. The inner part is lined with soft material like grasses, moss, animal fur, and feathers. Sticks will either be broken off of live trees or reused from old nests, with the male gathering most of the nesting material and presenting it to the female to do the actual nest building. Sometimes strange material like trash, wire, or sheep wool make it into the nest construction. And these nests are pretty big. They can get up to 5 feet across and 2 feet high. One crazy thing is that ravens lay up to 7 eggs. Their egg laying occurs in February in the southern part of the range and April in the northern part. The female does all the incubation, while the male does much more of the foraging for food. After about 3 weeks, the eggs hatch. And for about another 5 to 7 weeks, the chicks remain in the nest. Raven chicks are absolutely adorable. Definitely look them up. Think about a chicken, chick, except instead of yellow, it's black. The mom and dad feed them through regurgitation. So while they can lay up to 7 eggs, there is a pretty high egg mortality and nestling mortality rate, because on average they have a nesting success of 1.8 to 2.4, meaning usually 1 to 3 young actually survive to fledge. Usually the fledglings leave the nest around June, depending on how early in the year the eggs were laid. They almost always only do one brood. They will re-nest if their nest is destroyed or they lose all their young early on. However, in 2001 at the University of California, a pair of common ravens were observed actually raising a rare double brood, using a nest placed on a 3rd-story window awning. After leaving the nest, the juveniles are still not really good at flying and spend a considerable amount of time on the ground. This leaves them vulnerable to predators. Mom and dad help protect them, though, warning of danger and aggressively confronting potential predators. Parents care for the fledgling ravens and provide them supplemental feeding for 1 to 6 weeks, but there have been observations of juvenile ravens staying with their parents for an astounding 6 months. This is a really long time. I'm definitely anthropomorphizing here, but with how intelligent these birds are, it's not impossible to think they have a strong emotional attachment to their young. This prolonged developmental period has also been proposed as a reason why they are so intelligent. It allows for greater opportunities for them to learn skills from their parents and also to make mistakes in a protected environment. It really is similar to us humans, who compared to other animals have a super long developmental period. After they leave their parents, juveniles will join non-breeding flocks of ravens until they are ready to settle down and mate. These flocks are really interesting. I don't have time to go into a ton of detail about them, but there's been a lot of research into the complex social arrangements of these groups. These juvenile flocks work together to secure food, but they're also constantly fighting and competing with each other. Just like how all teenagers, all they want to do is hang out with other teenagers, juvenile ravens have been shown in laboratory conditions to preferentially want to hang out with other juveniles. And they can even discriminate juvenile calls from adult calls and preferentially move towards those juvenile calls. Eventually, hopefully, the juveniles will mate and settle down. This can be as close as a few kilometers from where they were born to up to 11,000 kilometers away, the longest dispersal ever recorded. Females appear to have more philopatry than males, meaning they tend to end up closer to home than males, which wander off a bit more. I haven't heard any ravens yet, sitting here in Gaudineer Forest, surrounded by these massive spruce. Have heard the teetering of those chickadees I talked about, and I think some kingbirds too, those high-pitched sounds. But if we were hearing ravens, we would probably hear their distinctive quirk. Ravens will modulate how loudly they give their call, and at its loudest it can be heard about a mile away. They seem to have dialogue with their calls, answering each other and calling back and forth. Close attention can reveal distinctive nuances in the calls of individual ravens, as if each has their own accent. Something that is really sweet and sort of sad is if a raven loses its mate, it will imitate that mate's specific call to try and call it to return. They also give a wide variety of alarm calls. And other contact calls. When raised in captivity, they can be taught to imitate sounds and human speech.
Are you all right?
What's the matter? What's the matter, Mum?
Treasure. Say, are you all right?
What's the matter?
Good girl, and again. Go on then. Sing for us. Go on.
What's the matter? What's the matter, Mum?
I'm looking for treasure, I've told you.
Awesome. We got a mixed flock moving through right now, right by me. Black-capped chickadees leading the way as always. As this mixed flock continues to move through, hopefully we'll have some red-breasted nuthatches come through. I always love hearing them. Let's talk about kind of threats to ravens and also their threat to other birds and about their population. In the early 1800s, raven populations were severely declined due to human persecution and were even locally extirpated in areas. This was across the range in the US and Eurasia also. They were thought of as pest birds that ate crops, and there was probably some superstition also playing a role. They were regularly shot on sight or trapped and killed. They were also killed as products of poisoning efforts with strychnine to reduce wolf and grizzly bear populations. This practice continued in the 1960s in the US and Canada. I read one terrible account where at a strychnine bait site in the Yukon, a grizzly bear, 2 wolves, 6 magpies, countless chickadees, and 10 ravens were found dead. The raven population crash was especially severe in the eastern U.S., to the point where their range was restricted to only a few places of refugia in the Appalachian Mountains, like here in Gaudineer. In fact, ravens in the eastern U.S. are still thought to be in a recolonization phase and haven't reached their maximum population density. Another cause of their population collapse was overhunting of the megafauna whose carcasses they depended on as a food source, especially during winter. As populations of bison, moose, elk, and deer collapsed, so did raven populations. As they gained protection status under laws such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, their populations began to recover, and now they're even spreading into areas where historically they did not occur, which can be a big problem to other native species. In some areas, their population has absolutely exploded, like in the Great Basin regions of the American Midwest, where in the past 50 years their population has increased by 460%. They are a threat to some endangered or near-threatened bird species. They are a known predator to the endangered California condor, preying upon their nests. They also depredate nests of the near-threatened greater sage grouse. Video monitoring has estimated common ravens alone are responsible for over 50% of egg and nestlings stolen from greater sage grouse nests. One study I read found a correlation between raven densities of greater than 0.4 ravens per kilometer and poor greater sage grouse nesting success. A raven about every 2 kilometers, that's a good amount of ravens, especially when considering, how far these birds can travel in a day in search of food. They also prey heavily on nests of the near-threatened snowy plover, the California least tern, the western snow plover, and the marbled murrelet. And they're also a predator of the endangered Mojave Desert tortoise. Specifically, they eat the tortoise in its first 5 to 7 years of life when its shell is so soft that the ravens can just kind of gobble it up. And this has led to wildlife services actually enacting population control measures on ravens. One method is through poisoning using a chemical called DRC 1339. This chemical is chosen because ravens are particularly sensitive to it, helping to reduce inadvertently poisoning other species. In papers I read, it's actually referred to as corvicide, like insecticide, but for corvids. Ravens are also trapped and shot. In the UK and Scotland, special permits are actually issued to sheep herders to protect young lambs from ravens via shooting. Non-lethal measures are also used, such as hazing. I talked about this in my vulture episode. No, hazing birds doesn't mean that you make them chug a lot of beer at a frat party. Rather, it's using methods to try and scare them away, like playing hot calls or shooting flares. Prompt removal of carcasses, whether that's roadkill or beached whales, also helps to control their population. Illegal poisoning and shooting of ravens also still goes on. I read an article that unequivocally acknowledged the widespread illegal poisoning of ravens by dairy farmers in the Mojave Desert. A major reason why ravens have been able to spread to areas that they were previously not in is, you guessed it, anthropogenic or man-made causes. Landfills and ample roadkill from cars basically serve as an all-you-can-eat buffet for ravens and help to support their populations. Roadkill isn't the only source of carcasses. Introduction of cattle to areas also provides a source of corpses when those cows kick the proverbial milk bucket. Ravens are generalist species and are highly adaptable to new resources. So, when man comes in and changes an environment, ravens are able to adapt to it and survive. They also heavily use human structures such as power lines and cell towers as roosting and nesting spots, and have been the cause of some power outages from this activity. Power lines actually help to support raven populations, according to a study out of Idaho I read. It's theorized that this is because they provide perching and nesting places, but also because non-native grasses that better support raven populations tend to be planted around them. The power lines are also sort of like a highway to allow ravens to cross inhospitable areas of desert or arid Great Plains and arrive at areas where, say, there's a man-made lake or a nice smelly landfill where they can survive. Human structures are a double-edged sword for ravens. While studies have found increased nest productivity for raven nests found near roads, proximity to roads is also associated with lower fledgling and adult survival. While as humans may provide some easy food options, our cars, windows, and pets can be death traps for ravens. Ravens do have natural predators from carnivorous mammals and birds of prey. In the American West, coyotes appear to be the biggest threat to ravens. In a study where 240 juvenile ravens were radio-collared and tracked in the Mojave Desert, 44 of the 77 juvenile ravens who died during the study were killed by coyotes. And, like I said that the nest mortality, is pretty high with eggs. They can lay up to 7 eggs, but really only 1 to 2 ravens on average usually hatch and fledge. Juvenile raven death is also pretty large, particularly that period when they leave the nest and aren't super adept at flying yet. However, juvenile survival rate goes up after that critical period. A study in the Mojave Desert found that after their first year of life, raven survival averaged around 88% every year for the rest of their juvenile years. Adult ravens, and especially mated ravens, have a very low mortality rate. This is likely because they are helping to support and watch out for each other. Crows are major competitors with ravens, while smaller crows flock in greater numbers and can outcompete ravens when they have those numbers on their sides. Ravens seem to communicate with crows, having a specific scream call that they have been observed using when crows are around. And crows are sort of the reason why ravens are not really found in urban areas. Crows dominate the cities, and the ravens are more like the country bumpkins, out in the forest. Wild ravens are thought to live an average of 13 years, with the oldest known wild raven at 22 years, 7 months when it was banded and recaptured in Nova Scotia. However, ravens in captivity live a lot longer. In particular, there are captive ravens in the Tower of London that have lifespans up to 40 years. The story of why ravens are in the Tower of London is pretty crazy. Legend has it that King Bran the Blessed had his head buried beneath White Hill, where the tower now stands, with his head facing towards France to protect it against invasion. Bran in Welsh means raven. This makes me think of Bran in Game of Thrones, who can control ravens with his mind. As far as who actually put the ravens in the Tower of London, there's conflicting legends to that, but there seems to have been ravens in the tower dating back to the reign of King Charles II in the mid-1600s. This is also when the prophecy developed that if ravens leave the Tower of London, that Britain will fall. The ravens today have sort of a mini celebrity following. Their numbers fluctuate based on accidental deaths, like in 2013 when a fox snuck into the tower and killed 2 ravens, and also when new chicks are brought in. Apparently one of the ravens, named Thor, can even say good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
So if you're ever in London, be sure to check out the ravens of the Tower of London. The current population of common ravens is estimated at 29 million. All right, y'all, let's wrap up this episode talking about the evolution of common ravens. So ravens belong to the group Corvidae, with the corvids. I already discussed Corvidae evolution in my blue jay episode, also in my shrike episode, so I won't belabor the point here. But roots of what are called the core corvids that contains crows, shrikes, vireos, birds of paradise, drongos, butcher birds, orioles, monarch flycatchers, and a few other bird species. These core corvids originated in the islands around Australia, possibly New Guinea, during the late Eocene around 34 million years ago. Corvidae was the largest group to emerge from these core corvids and contains 130 species of what I'd like to call our classic corvids: jays, magpies, jackdaws, crows, and ravens. Crows and ravens are actually in the same genus, Corvus, that evolved relatively late in the corvid evolutionary tree, about 17 million years ago. They evolved in the Palearctic region, a region that basically comprises all of Europe and Northern Asia. Early on, they seemed to disperse to North America, likely via the Bering Strait, and quickly spread across the Americas down to the Caribbean. Africa and Australia, however, were colonized relatively recently, about 5 million years ago. And a lot of raven-crow speciation appears to have occurred within the past few million years. Like I said, crows and ravens are in the same genus, so the term raven or crow is based more on morphological traits rather than strict evolutionary relationships. There are crows that are close relatives to ravens and vice versa. Some of the closest relatives to the common raven, the pied crow and the white-necked raven, largely have a strictly African distribution, and their common ancestor dates back to about 3.5 million years ago, according to One Zoom Tree of Life. This hints that rather than being part of that first wave of corvids that came to the Americas, the common raven and their closest relative, the Chihuahuan raven, are evidence of multiple corvus colonization events to North America. Mitochondrial studies of common ravens across their range show two distinct lineages. One lineage concentrated around California and Western America, and the other basically distributed everywhere else in their range. This is super weird because these two lineages are not isolated. The western U.S. population commingles and ends up breeding with the eastern population and vice versa all the time. It's thought that these two distinct lineages are actually a result of something called speciation reversal, where two separate species hybridize so much that they become one species. Basically, it's thought that these two lineages come from a common ancestor, but the western U.S. population became its own distinct species from the other Holarctic common ravens, probably during periods of glaciation or desertification that isolated them. But then, as they were able to start hybridizing again, they became a common species. I mean, I guess it shows just how much individual ravens can distribute, that they can hybridize enough that across the entire northern hemisphere they've become one common species. Another complicating evolutionary factor is the Chihuahuan raven. It's a phenotypically distinct raven species that inhabits southwestern America. This is the common raven's closest ancestor, but really it's the closest ancestor of that California lineage, not the wider Holarctic lineage. What keeps the Chihuahuan raven its own distinct species is that it's morphologically different enough that it doesn't mate or hybridize with common ravens. So basically what happened is about 3 million years ago, there were actually two proto-common raven species. One that was more specialized for the colder climates of Europe, northern Asia, and the eastern US, while the other one was specialized and isolated to the American West and Southwest. This cowboy raven further speciated into the Chihuahuan raven about 2 million years ago, a true desert specialist. However, the California raven retained enough similarities to that Holarctic raven that as they became less geographically isolated and the two species intermixed, they became one. With this complicated evolutionary history, it's no surprise that there are subspecies of the common raven. There's about 8 to 11 recognized subspecies. Some of these subspecies are endangered, such as the subspecies that inhabits the Canary Islands off the west coast of Africa. There are also several other island raven populations, such as the ravens on Attu Island of the Alaskan Aleutian Islands, that have reduced genetic diversity due to their isolation, bottlenecking, and the founder effect, but aren't quite subspecies. There used to be a subspecies of raven on the Faroe Islands that was actually black and white and known as the pied raven. Much of its decline had to do with the so-called beak tax, enacted from 1742 to 1881, where men who did not deliver a certain amount of bird beaks a year were fined. The birds targeted were those thought to compete with fishermen, like Atlantic puffin and guillemot, and predatory birds thought to attack livestock, like ravens, crows, gulls, and the white-tailed eagle. The last pied raven was shot in the Faroe Islands in 1902. And that's my episode on common ravens, y'all. I hope you liked it. There was a ton of information out there. I tried to kind of distill down to some of the, best things and give a good life history of the bird. I'm sorry if I didn't talk about your favorite raven legend, spooky story, or mythology. There was just a ton out there, so I did really have to pick and choose. Ravens really lie large in the human mythos. And even if they're killing baby lambs and hurting endangered bird species, I still love them. They're just such a smart bird, and the way that they've adapted to so many different environments. And, as I studied them, I was like, this is probably the most human bird species, and maybe that's why they live so large in the human psyche and in so many of our myths and legends. Well, y'all, that's all I got. Be sure to write in. Let me know if you want some stickers. And as always, stay dirty, fellow birdies. Dirty Bird Podcast is brought to you by me, John, with my rotating panel of guests and co-hosts. Thanks for being on the show, everybody. The Dirty Bird theme song is by Ricky Pistone. Check out his groovy and hilarious music videos on YouTube. The outro music you're listening to right now is a song New York Redneck by the Sidewalk Slammers. Check them out wherever you get your music. The Dirty Bird podcast logo is by the very talented TJ Ranoski. And of course, a shout out to my beautiful wife, Lauren, who created my original logo. Check out the show notes for this episode for a full list of credits for any bird calls or sounds used in the episode. Thanks for listening.
At the track, drive into Brooklyn, ain't never coming back. Tim's on the ground in the concrete jungle. I might get into a little rumble. Ain't nothing but a high-tailing man, bred on the farm, so I work with my hands. Just call me a New York redneck. Where's the banjo, play that Bellafay. And I might be high class, but my liquor is more. They took my land, so it ain't my fault. Just call me a New York redneck. Ain't my fault. It ain't my fault. Yeah, it ain't my Got a car in the front, but a truck in the back, and I like the New York Mets and my cowboy